Hi, today we're going to talk a bit around some of the key themes we've seen coming out in Diligence on transactions involving fundraisers and acquisitions that we've been involved in the tech space. So I've got James Peck with me, who heads up the tax team within our tech and high growth team. So James, maybe just start off with giving us a bit more background on the sort of transactions you've been involved in the last few months.
So generally speaking, there's been kind of two tranches of transactions that we've been working through. Either we're working and supporting some of the UK-based VCs as they're looking to make strategic investments into Series A, Series B businesses, and being engaged directly by the VC themselves in order to undertake a tax due diligence and financial due diligence in terms of the key pertinent areas that may create red flags. So therefore, the VC is aware of the issues prior to the transaction. The second type of transaction that we've been working on, and is more, we're seeing this more currently, is later stage tech companies who are looking to make either acquisitions or again strategic investments into earlier stage, Series A generally or Series B tech companies. So both of those kind of areas are the kind of key areas that we're looking at and doing the sensitivity analysis in terms of the kind of tax and financial diligence process.
And on the tax diligence process, how are you generally scoped to perform that work? Like, what does that look like?
Well, generally we provide a number of different scopes depending on fundamentally a couple of things, either the complexity of the potential target, so looking at to what extent it has overseas operations, looking at the complexity of the group, the interaction of the group, or alternatively, it might just simply boil down to what stage of business it is. So certain Series A businesses, a lot of the VCs or the later stage tech companies will want a much higher level, right? So just looking at kind of the key red flags that may be arising. However, by the time you get to a Series B, you're probably going into quite a lot more detail, really understanding more of the complexity around the group and getting under the skin of that so that actually you're able to flesh out any of those red flags or indemnities or warranties that will create price or value chips, which we're seeing happening more and more now.
Let's dig into a little bit around the Series B stage diligence, which is obviously where the business has scaled and generally speaking, you know, maybe there's been some things, let's say, missed along the way or some holes that may have been created. Just run us through, you know, a couple of areas that you think you're seeing common as themes through this Series B sort of stage diligence.
So just as an overarching point, I think we can touch on some of the common themes that we're seeing, but generally speaking, it's always done on a kind of case-by-case basis. We're seeing individual scenarios coming out, and what we're going to do today is just identify some of the themes that we're seeing across the piece. So I think one of the common themes that we're seeing, and this is prevalent in light of the fact that, you know, after COVID, we're seeing a larger expansion of workforce overseas, but also a relaxation of allowing individuals to work on a global basis. So we're seeing a lot more permanent establishment risks being created. Now, one of the main reasons that that's being created is that people are using employer of records now to engage directly with individuals. So EOR is being used on a global basis to hire people, which is, you know, fundamentally it's a great thing because you're able to hire people quickly, succinctly, and bring them into market. But at the same time, that's creating potential taxable or tax presences in overseas jurisdictions. And we've had a number of instances on transactions over the last, say, 6 months, where because of what's happened over the last 2 years, there's quite a large amount of exposure that's being created in multiple jurisdictions that arises. And therefore, that's only coming to light as part of the diligence process. And therefore, what is the tax consequence of that?
In terms of if you was a CFO looking to head some of that stuff off before diligence, what would you be doing to deal with that potential PE risk that you're talking about?
So the PE risk that I'm talking about here is really to understand to what extent are you creating a taxable presence in a jurisdiction that isn't, say, the UK main trading entity. So for instance, if you've got, PE exposure in multiple countries, then to what extent and how long, so to what extent is that creating a taxable residence and how long have you had it? And what is a sensible and proportionate kind of profit attribution attached to those relevant individuals?
Yeah.
Right. Similarly, to what extent should you be creating some kind of local entity in country? And to what extent is that triggering any kind of interest and penalties through non-compliance over a period of time? Now, generally speaking, at a Series B, the view that quite a lot of CFOs are taking that if that's relatively low level and they've assessed that risk, then actually it's potentially something that could be fixed post-transaction. But unfortunately, we've seen it on quite a large scale where we've had 10, 15, 20 individuals that are potentially creating PE risks. And that's created over a number of years quite a large exposure, which therefore needed to create a red flag as part of the wider due diligence reports. So how do you get ahead of the curve? I think one of the areas that we're going to cover in more detail is when we do some of the sessions on international tax exposure. We'll be looking at exposure to PE risk. And again, that'll be something that I would look at. So how are you creating PE risks overseas? What are the triggers? How long have you done that for? And again, just starting to think through actually, where have I allowed people to go? Do I have oversight of where those individuals are based, both in the UK and overseas? Do I have internal policies and procedures that allow for overseas travel? And therefore, to what extent is there an overarching risk for the business as a whole?
Just nodding on international, and you mentioned we'll do a separate session on international in a bit more detail. Transfer pricing, I know, has been an issue that has come up that's caused some uncertainty in the middle of transactions where there's some uncertainty around whether a business has actually reported correct positions in different jurisdictions. What have you seen in this space in terms of problems and how that could have been rectified, I guess, before transaction?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's always an inflection point in a business when transfer pricing probably comes more to the focal point than anything else. And it's generally an inflection point where companies start to push revenues out of the UK business and down into local subs, which really is the point where transfer pricing needs to be a key area of consideration. When it's not being considered, or alternatively where it's being considered poorly without consideration for kind of benchmarking analysis and actually the kind of fundamentals as to why there needs to be an intercompany charge and what the foundational basis of that intercompany charge are, that can create unwanted tax consequences. I'm just thinking of a situation we had recently where we were doing a Series B due diligence, and one of the areas that was identified was that the subsidiary of Spain, that was the main development centre, had never thought about putting any kind of transfer pricing in place. And as a result, actually, the transfer pricing adjustment wasn't huge in terms of the impact for the wider group, but the penalties that arose as a result that were going to be imposed or potentially could have been imposed by the Spanish tax authorities far outreached actually what the impact would have been from an accounting perspective. So one of the things that we generally look at is to what extent have the wider group thought about transfer pricing? To what extent, have they documented? And by what I mean by documented, I generally mean, have they drawn up some sensible, proportionate levels of interfirm agreements with an overarching theme explaining why they've applied any level of kind of consideration to it? To what extent have they considered, some kind of markup on relevant costs? And generally speaking, if there's been very little or no consideration, I think there are concerns there that the profits potentially arising arising incorrectly, or alternatively, that actually you have a disconnect between where profits arise within the group and where the losses are being made, and therefore actually it may be something that you'd want to rectify prior to a transaction so that you're rolling into it in knowing exactly what the group as a whole should look like and ensuring that's properly considered.
In terms of transfer of contracts or of IP across borders, we know, particularly with US expansion, we see this where, historically you've had customers engaging in the UK, but potentially then start engaging with the US.
Yeah.
I know that's come up a few times, so maybe touch on that as well would be good.
Yeah, so one of the key concerns that we see is, as you said, if you transition from having your contracts with a customer through the UK entity and then wanting to move that contract directly across into, say, an overseas subsidiary, the movement of that contract, which is akin to an intangible fixed asset, could be seen by the UK tax authorities as an exit of that intangible fixed asset, which could give rise to a tax charge on the exit, so a migration charge that could arise. Due care and attention is needed to think about actually when should you transfer that contract and what the mechanism for transferring that contract should effectively be. Simply lifting and shifting the contract or novating it mid-contract or when it comes to a close, again, is likely to create a tax charge. And again, we've seen multiple instances where that's come up during diligence and unfortunately would create a red flag, which would need further scrutiny to understand exactly what the value is of that asset leaving the UK would be. Similar to IP, similar to contracts, we've also seen multiple instances where wider IP has been transferred out of the UK into overseas jurisdictions. And again, similar considerations are required to think about actually what was the market value of that asset when it was transferred out of the UK tax net. And again, does that in some way, shape or form create a taxable point that HMRC will look to charge tax on? So again, due care and attention is needed. Now, what I'm not saying is it's not possible to do those things, but you do need to seek advice in relation to how you effectively move IP or contracts from the UK to overseas jurisdictions.
So getting some sort of opinion at that point, you want to actually do that from a tax point of view.
You take advice in relation to the mechanism by which you would move it. And again, some of the wider transfer pricing considerations or the transfer pricing considerations would take into account potential transferring of some of those IP or the contracts when you were looking at the wider piece.
Yeah, okay. Just moving away from the international aspects, another piece that we have seen cause problems is around share options.
Yes.
Obviously quite an emotive topic, given at the point of a transaction, typically speaking, share option holders are going to want to have the most tax efficient outcomes they can have and have planned to have. And this comes up, more often than it should, or we'd like it to, but maybe touch a little bit on where you've seen that cause a problem, either in diligence or at point of an exit transaction.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those things that we see go wrong far too often. Especially around kind of tax incentived share option schemes, so EMI and CSOP. I think fundamentally we see a position where we see poorly implemented schemes, where there hasn't been the required kind of administrative areas that have followed through with it. And therefore, as a result, what we're seeing is people considering that they've got EMI or CSOP options that, again, actually, frankly, just never qualified as EMIs or CSOPs, and therefore always unapproved options. So the point here is that those individuals are actually being taxed, or effectively can be taxed, at around 50-55%, when they had a kind of theoretical view that was going to be taxed at 10%. If we look at the kind of key areas and the issues that are generally faced, it's things like poor valuation, so not considering wider valuation metrics when the EMI scheme is initially set up, so not thinking about subsequent fundraise events or fundraising at similar times to when the valuation is being attained. We're looking at poorly drafted legal documentation. We're also looking at things like when HMRC respond and you're given a time frame by which you can grant your options, not granting within the time frame and not going to HMRC to openly acknowledge that you've not granted within the time frame specified by them. And unfortunately, the one that we see more often than not is failure to demonstrate any kind of level of notification within 92 days of granting the options. Now, unfortunately, we know that there are issues with HMRC in terms of the filing of those. But again, that comes up more frequently than we'd want to see. And again, it's just one of those areas where we're seeing EMI schemes fall over. Some of the other kind of fringe areas that we see is that individuals that should never have been granted EMI options. Again, we're seeing that come through, or where individuals are leaving the business and therefore not exercising options within certain timeframes, or actually when there's a pivot within the business and therefore actually the company or the group no longer effectively qualify for EMI. So there are, unfortunately, with EMI is a hugely advantageous scheme. And with any hugely advantageous scheme, there's always going to be a number of areas number of qualifying criteria, both for the company, for the shares, for the individuals, that will need to be met. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that when you're looking at it under scrutiny during diligence, all of these are kind of a lighter shone on all these areas. And then any of the kind of historical issues that have surfaced will then come out as part of the diligence process.
So just to wrap, maybe just give us one more clanger that you've seen come up that's scuppered a transaction, fundraise or a transaction that we haven't touched on so far.
One of the ones that I think was quite surprising when it came up that we saw on a transaction at the back end of last year was actually R&D tax credits. So we're all aware, obviously, that there is increased scrutiny at the moment from HMRC in terms of the level of review that's being undertaken. I think also it's quite interesting to see that HMRC are and have been currently paying out the tax credits and then inquiring into R&D claims at a later stage. I think that seems a slightly different way of looking at things. I'm not quite sure why they pay out and then inquire at a later stage. We've seen companies, a number of fronts, actually just incorrectly claiming R&D, right? We had a case at the back end of last year, like I said, where R&D probably wasn't in place, but they'd been able to, or they'd submitted R&D claims for a long period of time, and they just rolled forward in terms of the R&D, in terms of the templates they were providing. And actually, HMRC would scrutinise it and then consider, actually, is this even R&D in the first place? We've seen errors made when it comes to government grants and state aid finance, so claiming under the wrong scheme. We've seen, again, something that's coming up, because obviously there are changes effective from April 23 in terms of what qualifying spend looks like, or what can be claimed as qualifying expenditure. And we've seen incorrect qualifying expenditure being included in historical claims. So these are kind of key areas and considerations that, unfortunately, quite often, it seems like quite a simple point to get R&D right. And I think there have been, for years, very aggressive approaches undertaken by some of the boutiques in terms of R&D. Now, that aggressive approach has only suggested that potentially incorrect R&D claims have been submitted, or actually incorrect qualifying expenditure has been included, both leading to further kind of fees for some of the more aggressive boutiques. And as a result, we're seeing that come up more and more now. And if HMRC are uncertain around any of those areas, then they'll scrutinise it and they will look and pull apart the entire claim. And we've therefore seen that's one of the worst situations that arises during a diligence, because if it's flagged or HMRC look at it any time during or leading up to a diligence process, then unfortunately it's something that could take a very long time to resolve. And actually, therefore, it creates a lot of uncertainty as a business goes into a due diligence process.
So just to be clear on that, if you're getting diligence, you're probably going to have another R&D team in whoever's diligencing you, reviewing your previous R&D claims.
Yes.
And if they think there's something in those claims that they don't like, they could be questioning that you've overclaimed, potentially. And how far back would a diligencer say you could go in the event that you've got items in there they think you've overclaimed? How far back?
So generally we would look at, 2 years to start with. But if we saw something that was incorrect for those 2 years, then we could potentially go back as far as 7 years and look to see and determine actually to what extent. Now, the other issue that's faced at that point is actually were the individuals that were involved in the business and pulling together claims even 2 years ago, let alone 5-7 years ago, actually still in the business. So there could be a loss of knowledge at that point. And that can lead to, well, if no one has the information that can be made available, how are you able to quantify that, and how would you demonstrate to HMRC that there is qualifying expenditure back at that time? And that is a really challenging area that needs to be considered.
And that could then be calculated as some sort of valuation chip or some sort of
value chip, price chip,
or,
definitely, absolutely.
Understood. Yeah.